This is the visual that is stopping the world this morning. As of the early hours of Monday, May 4th, 2026, American destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, unmanned drone platforms, and 15,000 U.S. service members are moving right now toward the Strait of Hormuz under a presidential operation that Donald Trump announced just hours ago on Truth Social and named with the kind of branding confidence that ignores how close the world is to the edge: Project Freedom. And Iran's military has just issued its response. If any American force approaches or enters the Strait of Hormuz, Iran will attack, not issue a warning, not file a diplomatic protest. Attack. Those were the words delivered publicly, in full view of every government, every market, and every naval commander watching one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. Pause for a second and absorb the weight of that. The United States is launching a military escort operation into a strait where the country it has been at war with since February 28th has already promised to fire on its forces. A tanker was already struck by multiple small boats near the strait on Sunday evening before Project Freedom officially began. The crew was safe. The message was not. But here's the problem. This is no longer a diplomatic standoff. The ships are moving. The threats are active. And the global economy is now hanging on a 2-mile-wide corridor of water. In this breakdown, we're going to walk through exactly what Project Freedom is and what it is not. Why Iran's threat this morning is fundamentally different from every warning that came before it. What's happening inside the White House as destroyers move into position. Why shipping executives around the world are watching this with panic. And what happens to the global economy if the next 24 hours go wrong. Because this morning, the world is not watching negotiations. It is watching the opening phase of a possible direct naval confrontation between the United States and Iran. And the timing could not be worse. 65 days ago, Donald Trump stood before the American people and announced the launch of Operation Epic Fury, a sweeping joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign designed to eliminate Iran's nuclear ambitions, dismantle IRGC infrastructure, and restore freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. At that time, the strait carried roughly 20 million barrels of oil every day, nearly 1/5 of the planet's daily petroleum supply. The promise from the White House was clear. The operation would be swift, surgical, decisive. Iran would be forced to the negotiating table within weeks. The strait would reopen before global markets suffered permanent damage. That was the promise. The reality became something very different. Because Iran did not collapse. The supreme leader was killed in the opening strikes, but the regime stayed intact. And within 72 hours of Operation Epic Fury beginning, the IRGC functionally sealed the Strait of Hormuz. Not partially, not symbolically, completely. What happens next changed the entire global economy. Shipping traffic collapsed almost overnight. Insurance companies refused to cover transits through the area. Tanker captains stopped sailing into what many described as an active minefield. Traffic through the world's most critical energy choke point dropped to roughly 5% of normal levels. And according to multiple reports, the Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to shut the strait entirely. That miscalculation is now visible everywhere. Gasoline above $4 per gallon. Brent crude over 110. Fertilizer prices surging globally, and a diplomatic framework that has now deteriorated so completely that the administration's answer this morning is not negotiation. It is Project Freedom, a military escort operation entering waters where Iran has publicly promised to open fire. This is where things change, because at some point today, American-guided missile destroyers will enter the Strait of Hormuz. They will not be alone. CENTCOM confirmed that Project Freedom includes over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, unmanned platforms, and roughly 15,000 American personnel. The official mission is humanitarian, to guide neutral civilian vessels out of the Persian Gulf. Hundreds of ships have been stranded there since February 28th, with tens of thousands of sailors trapped aboard vessels running low on supplies. Some crews have reportedly begun rationing food and fresh water. Trump framed Project Freedom as a rescue operation. Iran responded immediately. Iranian military officials declared they would attack U.S. forces if they entered the strait. The chairman of Iran's Parliamentary National Security Commission labeled the operation a ceasefire violation before it even began. And then came the attack Sunday night. A cargo ship near the strait struck by multiple fast attack boats. No official claim of responsibility. But the method was familiar. Fast boats have been one of the IRGC's signature tactics for decades. The timing mattered. The attack happened less than 24 hours before American destroyers were scheduled to move in. And while this was happening, shipping executives around the world were not expressing relief. They were expressing fear. One maritime executive warned publicly that safe passage requires cooperation from both sides, not just military announcements. Another warned ship operators to remain extremely cautious because Iran had already framed the operation as an act of escalation. Think about that for a second. The very people Project Freedom claims to protect are watching it with dread. But here's where most people miss it. This is not just about military force. It is about credibility. Because in recent weeks, American destroyers already conducted a limited test transit near the strait. Iranian media reported that IRGC forces confronted those ships directly and launched drones toward them. The destroyers turned back. That incident barely became a headline. But inside military circles, it became something far more important, a precedent. Today, the United States is returning to the same waters with vastly larger forces. And the central question now is brutally simple. Does Iran back down when faced with overwhelming force? Or does it fire anyway? Because one warning shot in the wrong moment could collapse the ceasefire entirely. And according to reports from national security insiders, the decision to launch Project Freedom was not built on a unified consensus inside Washington. It was built on pressure. Political pressure, economic pressure, strategic pressure. Domestic polling numbers have deteriorated sharply since the war began. Gas prices surged again last week. Congress is openly restless over the expired 60-day war powers deadline. Trump addressed the issue by telling lawmakers hostilities had effectively ended. Legal experts publicly challenged that claim. Several Republicans reportedly want either formal authorization or a clear exit strategy. Instead, they received a Truth Social announcement and a military operation named Project Freedom. This is where the stakes become dangerous. Because inside the Pentagon, the concern is no longer abstract. It is operational. American commanders are now preparing for the possibility that Iranian fast attack boats or drones could approach escorted civilian vessels at extremely close range. And if that happens, decisions will need to be made in seconds. Not hours, not days, seconds. A commander in the strait may have less than 2 minutes to determine whether an Iranian maneuver is intimidation or the opening phase of an attack. And the rules of engagement have not been publicly disclosed. That matters enormously. Because once shots are fired, the legal crisis and the military crisis arrive simultaneously. What happens next could define the entire war. Under the War Powers Resolution, sustained military engagement beyond 60 days requires congressional authorization. Operation Epic Fury began February 28th. The clock expired April 28th. Legal scholars across the political spectrum have already argued that ongoing naval operations and blockades qualify as active hostilities. Now, Project Freedom adds direct escort operations inside contested waters where Iran has already promised to attack. If American personnel are killed during this operation, the constitutional crisis in Washington explodes instantly. Congress will be forced to act, and the administration will be forced to explain why troops were deployed into combat conditions without formal authorization. At the same time, global shipping companies are trapped inside an impossible situation. The U.S. Treasury warned that any shipper paying Iran's massive transit tolls could face sanctions. But Iran controls the strait, meaning commercial vessels cannot legally pay Iran and cannot safely pass without military protection. That trap is exactly what Project Freedom is attempting to break. And the deeper this crisis becomes, the more international divisions are starting to appear. China is watching this carefully. Beijing reportedly believes the crisis strengthens its leverage against Washington. Every spike in oil prices, every sign of American overextension, every fracture among U.S. allies improves China's strategic position. Russia benefits too. Higher energy prices directly increase Russian revenues. And America's traditional allies are increasingly cautious. The UK, France, and several European governments have explored diplomatic alternatives that avoid direct military escalation. A coalition statement supporting maritime security was led not by Washington, but by European allies. That detail matters, because it suggests the coalition behind American leadership is no longer fully aligned. And meanwhile, the strait itself remains the center of everything. 2 miles wide. That is what the global economy now depends on. 2 miles of water carrying nearly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade. 2 miles of water that the most powerful navy on Earth cannot simply force open without risking escalation. Trump named the operation Project Freedom, and freedom of navigation is a principle worth defending. But the name hides the reality. Freedom has a cost. And that cost this morning is 15,000 American personnel operating inside a mine threat environment against an adversary that has every incentive to create one controlled confrontation and force Washington into a larger crisis. This is where things become unpredictable. Expect Iran to test the operation, not with full-scale war immediately, but with drone approaches, fast boat harassment, close naval maneuvers designed to force split-second decisions. Expect the White House to answer with increasingly aggressive rhetoric, and watch Congress closely. Because the moment an American service member is wounded or killed under Project Freedom, the political crisis, legal crisis, and military crisis merge into one. The ceasefire is already fiction, the ships are already moving, and the next 48 hours may become the most dangerous period since this conflict began. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We are tracking Project Freedom in real time from the moment the first American vessel enters the strait. If there is an engagement, we will break it down immediately, because this is no longer background noise. This is the edge of everything. And the next few hours may determine whether the world steps back from escalation or slides directly into it.